lost private. We're in Normandy.
Thanks for checking in here at the We're Not Lost Private podcast. We appreciate all your support. But do you know how else you can support us? By signing up at Patreon. For $3 a month, you'll have access to all of our episodes, plus access to all kinds of bonus material, like our quarterly newsletter, photographs, and official paperwork, and research that goes into each and every show. You can follow the pod on a multitude of platforms such as YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, pretty much anywhere you catch your pods. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon. Welcome, everybody, to episode 36 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. I'm your host, Joe Muccia, and I've been looking forward to this particular show, and I probably say that every show, but this one in particular, because we are rapidly approaching the 81st anniversary of D-Day. And with that, I decided to, because I've done a number of D-Day shows in the past, and I've had guests on that have done D-Day shows with me as well, I decided I wanted to do something a little bit different to commemorate this year. Instead of doing another, random D-Day episode where we just kind of talk about one particular unit and how they performed, I decided to open the door up and look at a host of different Allied units. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to show the breadth and width of the impact on the Allied fighting force. But I also wanted to do a show that was going to look at the activity that happened before D-Day and just a few days or maybe a week or so before. I think a lot of people understand that the troops went into marshaling areas and they were given briefings and they were, issued their ammunition and, all the other things that happened before they either climbed onto their aircraft or they climbed onto their ships to make the cross-channel movement. And I figured it would be interesting to do this as an exercise in reading the accounts of the men themselves and hearing what they had to say about it. And it took a lot of parsing. I had to go back and look through a lot of my own interviews and then interviews that I obtained from other folks, and then also interviews from archives like the World War II Museum, the Ohio State Cornelius Ryan collection, and a number of other uh, places like the AHEC in Carlisle. If you don't know what the AHEC is, it's the Army Heritage and Education Center. They do house a number uh, of interviews there, and they're archived, and some of them you can access online. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I'd recommend, doing a little online research. Uh, First off, a little housekeeping. I want to thank Linda and Paul for joining the team. They became Patreon supporters, and I really wanted to say thank you for hopping on the team and becoming part of this. The community keeps growing, and I'm really proud of it. So that's the pitch. That's the story. We're going to look at what happened in the lead up to D-Day when the men were sent to their marshalling areas, which they like to call sausages, and that's where the name of the episode has come from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up some slides, and we're going to get this going. For those of you who are listening, I'll do my best to make sure that this is um, a visual presentation for you. So as you can see here, these men they're already in one of the staging areas, the camp areas. You can see the camouflage netting above them and the tents beyond them. Looks like it's a chow call. Everybody's eating. There's probably a briefing that went on around that. But the first thing we have to keep in mind when we talk about the preparations for D-Day, you also have to talk about how many times they'd been on dry runs. Everybody knows about Exercise Tiger and then all the Fabius exercises. There were a series of them, and these were meant to mimic what the men would experience on landing. And I think part of them did a disservice because a lot of the exercises were generally called after the landing was made and made a small advance inland, and they didn't get to exercise the full weight of their skills. And so that, coupled with the fact that they had done so many dry runs, it led to a bit of exercise fatigue amongst some of the troops, especially for the guys that had maybe done the landings in North Africa or Sicily or Italy. It was getting to be, uh, cumbersome and tiresome for them to go through these exercises. I placed a quote on this slide that I really thought was spoke to that very well, and it comes from Lieutenant Colonel James Lewis Moulton, who is the commanding officer of 48 Royal Marine Commando, and he said, "We could certainly do with some more training, but we could never recapture the old intensity. Better to go and have it over." And I think Colonel Moulton's his thought there was probably could have been repeated by thousands and thousands of other Allied troops at that point. And but the show must go on. They have to do it. It's not just about the men too. It's a complex choreography. These landings, especially seaborne, and the British were very good at it, and the Canadians really, without them, the D-Day landings don't happen. They carried the bulk of the assault forces into the beaches. They were augmented by U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard personnel and ships, but by and large, it was mostly U.S. It was mostly uh, British seamen and ships that took the Allied assault force in. And again, it's a complex choreography in that you also have air power involved. All of these things need to be coordinated. And if you read Sand and Steel, Peter Adams' excellent accounting of the run up to D-Day and then D-Day, you'll see accounts, you'll read accounts of so many things going wrong during these exercises where the timing was off, troops landing in the wrong places, air support or artillery or naval gunfire support either is hitting in the wrong areas or it doesn't come off on time at all. I mean, it's cataloged very well in Peter's book, and you get a feeling for the fact that despite the fact there might be exercise fatigue, there's still a need for all this. But as you get into the later stages of May of 1944, the exercises, they basically hit the high water mark. And as everybody knows who's watched like The Longest Day or read any of the counts in the lead up to D-Day, you know that a lot of things had to happen in order to get the troops where they needed to be and all the supplies and the vehicles. And you couldn't just do it. You couldn't just stop and do it on a dime. It had to be choreographed as well. Just like the landings, it had to be choreographed. There's landing tables that have to be adhered to when you're loading ships a certain way. And all these things had to be worked out. Well, they were worked out and finalized, and now they have to get the troops to the marshaling areas. And what I found interesting as I read through the different accounts from the troops was that there weren't there wasn't a uniform timeline for movement to staging areas or marshaling areas or the sausages, and then embarkation onto their ships, especially because a lot of them, the men and the vehicles and stuff, had to be placed on the ships, and then they had sailing time. Unlike the airborne folks who had basically got on their plane and had about an hour and a half, 2 hour flight time to the drop zone, these guys had to be loaded onto ship and then put in their berthing areas, and the supplies had to be, you know, placed in the cargo holes, and everything had to be staged perfectly so that when it's time comes to land the force, it comes off like a synchronized operation and not willy-nilly and slipshod where, things end up where they don't belong, or men and machines end up in places where they don't belong. And regardless, that happens anyway, as we see on D-Day. But it's interesting to note that a lot of these men talked about anywhere from late May to early June, or mid to late May to early June, as the time when they started moving towards these marshaling areas. And the first ones I wanted to look at, I did these kind of in an order where we were going to look at essentially what is the as Al Murray and James Holland call it on their excellent We Have Ways of Making You Talk podcast, the Duke forces, or the Dominion, UK, and Empire forces. I wanted to start with them and then work my way through the major U.S. assault divisions. So in this case, there's a great quote there from Arthur Berry, who was with the 127th Field Artillery of the Royal Artillery Regiment, and he said the atmosphere was unusual. This is after their arrival into the marshalling area. The atmosphere was unusual, to say the least, and there was almost a bank holiday atmosphere. We watched the latest American films. We were fed incredibly well and given free beer and cigarettes. We were surrounded by barbed wire and tents, played endless games of park in the park of football, cricket, quoits, which I'm not particularly familiar with that game. I had looked it up, but I've since forgotten it. With boxing, running, and other athletic competitions to kill the time, for we didn't know how long they would be there, essentially. And it's interesting because you'll note that obviously with the amount of athletics they're playing, this is meant to kill off nervous energy. I had spent considerable time in the desert in the run up to Operation Iraqi Freedom when we launched in March of 2003. And we, there's a lot of similarities to that waiting period as we got everything ready to go across the Iraq Kuwait border to what these guys must have felt as they were sitting around in their staging areas, because we moved up to staging areas as well, and by then the ammunition had been passed out and all the supplies had been passed out, and we were ready to go. And I would like to think that they were probably thinking that's about the same thing that me and my guys were thinking when we were there. But what's really interesting is some of the specific memories that each of some of these men have. In this case, I'm going to read a few passages from interviews that I have in my collection, mostly from the UK troops. In this case, Corporal William J. Thomas was aware early on that he and his unit, the South Wales Borderers of the 56th Infantry Brigade, would be part of the D-Day assault force. He said, a few months earlier, our brigadier announced that we would be part of Montgomery's 21st Army Group and spent many days in vigorous training at Inverary in Scotland, conducting assault landings and battle training. Thomas was particularly excited to get into action because he hadn't experienced combat yet, and they were expected to go ashore at Arromanches. We had been briefed regularly for weeks previous in the sealed camp and had in our minds a drill of a kind that we would land and how we would disperse and how our platoon would branch off and capture a bridge and hold it. And it's really interesting because he's already starting to talk about the briefings and all the preparations. Charles S. Wilson was the opposite of Thomas in that he was highly experienced. He was a 32-year-old private, and he was a runner in the headquarters of the 1st Hampshire Regiment. We went to bed early as we were to be up at 5 a.m. Some of us old hands discussed the places and people we knew during 1939 and 1940. It was going to be Wilson's second trip to the continent because he had been part of the force that was evacuated from Dunkirk. Sapper William Parker served in the Royal Engineers in 295 Field Company of the 231 Independent Assault Brigade of the 50th Division. He had an idea early on that his unit would be going into the second front, but only knew for sure on May 31st. His unit was embarked early on, like I was talking about. Some of these units went onto boats very early on compared to others. Some of that had to do with sailing time, but he said his unit was embarked early on, spending almost a week on board their ship, the Empire Spearhead, while they whiled away the time playing cards and housey, which is like a bingo-like card game. Again, you're going to hear the themes of gambling happening quite a lot, and some of it was centered around the invasion currency that was given to the men. A lot of them looked at it like funny money, easy come, easy go. They didn't feel like they would need it when they got on the continent. So a lot of guys kind of just gambled it away, along with any other money that they had on them. Lance Corporal Robert M. Swan of the 1st Battalion of the Dorsetshire Regiment, I'm sure I pronounced that terribly, and somebody will correct me, also the 231 Independent Assault Brigade of the 50th Northumbrian. He and his mates also played cards. He had taken part in the assault landings in Sicily and Italy and recalled that many of the lads attempted to cover up the fact that they were scared. He was also feeling it, and he wrote a letter home by his own admission, did so to unburden himself to his family, but he admittedly chickened out and tore the letter up and disposed of it. I found that was interesting. It's a good observation is a lot of nervous energy, and a lot of that has to do with compensation for the unknown, right? Guys are in there, they don't know what's coming. The older guys sometimes, the more experienced guys who'd seen action and maybe had experienced the loss of friends, probably started to clam up a little bit as they got closer to the actual, what they thought would be the actual D-Day. But it was very interesting that he decided to write this letter where he was going to talk about. I guess he never intimated what he was going to unburden himself about, but he ends up tearing up the letter. I also thought that was interesting. I also read there was a lot of reports of the guys being told to not take any personal letters or personal correspondence, onto the continent with them. So a lot of letters were burned or destroyed. Um, which just interesting. We were also told that before we launched. So it's something that continues to this day. I'm assuming it has to do, and this is what we were told, was you don't want to be captured with any personal correspondence and have the enemy maybe get your family's home address so they could, write them and say all kinds of things about you, and cause you more emotional distress besides being captured. So I would assume that that's what it had to do with. Moving on to the next slide. Many of the men talked about the briefings that they received. In this case, the image shows that the 22nd Independent Parachute Company of the 6th Airborne Division being briefed. I thought that was a great image to show. All the guys are kind of cued in as the CO is pointing at the places on the maps for them. Um, it's just a great image and really conveys the intensity when you look at their faces, how they're trying to absorb the information they're being provided. And all the assault echelons had to go through these briefings. For Joseph Collison, he was a 26-year-old Lance Corporal in the intelligence section of the 2nd Battalion Lincolnshire Regiment of the 9th Brigade, 3rd British Infantry Division. I wanted to make sure that I got the account of somebody who worked in intelligence. I had worked in intelligence as well. I knew all the preparations that I had to go through, not only for our own section, but you're briefing other sections and all the way up to battalions. In our case, because as the regimental level, it's very interesting to hear the reports from other intelligence professionals and how they prepared the assault echelons. In Collison's case, he recalled that he and his mates spent part of the time sorting through operational maps and putting them into groups to be issued to each of the sections and each of the subunits. Uh, if you're not familiar with how maps are set up, they're usually set up in a series of sheets that are all associated with one another. They generally border each other in some capacity. And generally you'll issue the maps for the particular operational area that you'll be going into. So in this case, what he was doing was he was just pulling the maps for the map sheets associated with the operational area and putting them in groups. So we'll just say each operational area was covered by 9 map sheets that were all could be attached to each other. He'd make up packages of those nine map sheets for each one of the sections, or maybe multiple sets for each one of those sections. He said they also created terrain models, and that was part of his section's responsibility. He said, I was a member of a team of different nationalities who made scale models of all the beaches in certain areas inland. These were issued to all units taking part in the landings. Consequently, for some time before D-Day, as early as July of 1943, I knew the location of the beaches. A good friend of mine, John Primerano, served in the 501st. He was actually in the communications section, but John was pretty sharp character, and he got tagged early on and placed on detached service. And I want to say, I can't say that John worked with Joe Collison, but John did work on a multinational team that built terrain models for the D-Day assault forces. And it was interesting to come across this account of another. This is because John's was the only mention I've ever read of this a multinational team of, we'll call them intelligence professionals, building terrain models that could be broken down and given out to the different assault echelons so that they could sit there and do terrain appreciation of their operational area. So this is the second person that was part of the force at that time that actually took part in it, besides my friend John. Just a real interesting tidbit there. Private John T.J. Gale had a hint that his unit, the 1st Battalion South Lanks, would be part of the opening of the second front, just based on all the training exercise they had been on. Once they were confined to their marshalling area, many of the lads made bets as to where they would be going. There were a good many guesses to the actual place of landings. The briefings were confined mainly to the beach objectives by actual model and aerial photos, but the actual names were left out. He added, "We had been cold-bloodedly told that there would be very high percentage of casualties. We were told we were going to be the first wave of infantry, the initial landing, and expected to be wiped out. It was a job we had to do, and there was no alternative." Bit of a fatalistic outlook on that, and I'm sure it's because it was probably the interview was probably done post-war, and he had time to reflect back on it. But it's interesting to to see him state that the briefings were confined to the beach areas and those objectives. And this is what I talked about with that earlier slide about exercise fatigue and how many of the exercises were cut short. And I think that ends up having uh, an adverse effect on the assault forces as they go in. Once they get past the beaches, especially when you start fighting in the hedgerow lands, in the bocage, I mean, it makes it very tough on them because they didn't really practice that a lot. And the leadership was warned, especially, there's plenty of accounts of Omar Bradley being informed of hedgerows in the bocage and what they were made of and how they were constructed. And yet it wasn't filtered down to the troops. And again, I think, part of the reason why it took so long for them to learn how to fight in that area was because they hadn't practiced it enough. And as another trooper's admission that they were ill prepared for it. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the things they carried, and I was able to find, because I wanted to have some equal representation, the report, the account from Robert Rogue, who was part of the Canadian Black Watch. I wanted to make sure we had some Canadian representation here. If you're looking at this on YouTube, you can see the slide. There's a Canadian soldier there. He is outfitted in typical kit for the Commonwealth forces. But I'm going to read directly from what Robert wrote about all of his kit. I've trimmed it a little bit for expediency's sake, but I've got the basics here for you. When we sailed, each man had his rifle, helmet, spike bayonet, gas mask, anti-gas cape, and the British-style two-piece battle dress uniform and a jacket. We had woolen shirts with no collars, wool socks, and boots. Our equipment consisted of webbing and 2 shoulder straps with 2 Bren gun pouches on the front. We crammed those pouches with socks, hand grenades, cigarettes, and clips of rifle bullets. We wore brown elastic suspenders instead of belts. There's a small button pocket on the right leg of the pants for a first aid packet, and we always carried a spare in our helmet netting. We didn't wear the short canvas puttees uh, that the British soldiers wore around their boots. Instead, we bloused our pants into our boots. We carried a small pack on our back, which was part of our full marching order. In this small pack, we had underwear, shirts, socks, personal gear, writing pads, pencils, envelopes, lots of cigarettes, and 2 items we called one was called a housewife, and the other was a hold-all, which we held our shaving gear, tooth, toothbrush and toothpaste, polish, of course, our sewing equipment, and we also had a rectangular aluminum mess set with a knife, fork, spoon, and each man had a pint-sized mug that was hung from one of the back straps. We had a quart water bottle carried on our right hip, and we each had 2 120-round bandoliers of clip rifle ammunition, and over all this, we wore our inflatable life belts. I mean, it must remind a lot of people who are fans of Band of Brothers when you have that Joe Toy monologue as they're waiting at the airfield on episode 1 to get loaded, where he starts talking about all the crap he's got to carry, and then he talks about getting and Jimmy Matteo playing Frank Briccani asks him, "Where are you going to put your brass knuckles?" I mean, in this regard, you get the full Monty when it comes to what the Commonwealth forces were carrying, because this is kind of standard. I mean, there's probably variations based on nationality, but in this case, a lot of the weapons and equipment would be the same. And if you're looking at this again on YouTube, you'll notice that that trooper's rifle is wrapped in a rubberized canvas bag and tied, and so he's ready for a water landing. Also on the slide, I wanted to point out this comes courtesy of historian Taft Gillingham off of X. I spotted this. He made this beautiful post uh, Sergeant Arthur Burton of the 1st Suffolk gave away his invasion currency as souvenirs. Of course, invasion currency would have been part of that big pile of gear and items that were stuffed in the backpack or in his pockets. He gave them away as souvenirs, and he added D-Day Monty's Boys inscriptions on it, which I thought was fantastic. So if you get a chance to check this out on YouTube, it's a great picture. He's have all his invasion currency along with some of the articles about his unit coming ashore. Now, the men that were assigned to vehicles had additional, duties that they had to take care of, and one of those was going to be waterproofing their vehicles. A lot of the vehicles came with waterproofing kits, and some of these had been tested out before D-Day, during the trial runs, during the exercises. But really, all the waterproofing kits centered around the exhaust system and engine decks of the various vehicles. For those of you who are big fans of the Sherman and listening to or watching footage from back then or looking at the pictures of the Invasion beaches, and you've noticed there's duplex drive Shermans, and then there's you know your regular Shermans, but they were fitted with the large exhaust ports off the back of the deck. Well, this wasn't the only waterproofing that had to be done. If you're looking at this on YouTube, you can see one of the pictures of the 4th County of London Yeomanry, uh, one of their tanks at the head of a column, and it's very easy to discern the waterproofing that's been done, especially around the bow gun and then the main gun and the mantlet. They were issued rubberized canvas and tape and this aluminum exhaust system or tubing that could be put on the decks of the tank. But for regular vehicles, they also had to be waterproofed. Again, a lot of it was focused on having exhaust extensions so they could ford in deep water. I want to say there's some footage of one of the Jeep coming ashore at one of the beaches where it's got the landing ford for the exhaust, and the driver's literally trying to stand up in his seat because the water is in the cab of the Jeep. William Henry was part of the 9th Battalion of the Durham Light Infantry of the 50th UK Division, and he wrote, "On my arrival, I was told I would have the small arms ammunition truck carrying 303 2-pounder anti-tank and 303 rifle and machine gun, 2-pounder anti-tank and 3-inch mortar ammo. I would be the D-Day plus 30 minutes. So I set about waterproofing the truck engine. On Saturday, the 3rd of June, about 3 o'clock, we got the order to form up in order of embarkation, and we spent the rest of the day checking our vehicles." Reggie Dale was a 31-year-old corporal whose 105th Infantry Brigade was attached to the UK's 30th Infantry Division. He was a Remy mechanic and remembered being assigned to a camp outside of New Haven. He and his buddies, Tommy Underwood, a barber in civilian life who was nicknamed Short Back and Sides, and Honest William Williams, played a lot of cards while waiting to embark. A good deal of time was spent waterproofing the section's trucks. The trio was responsible for a 3-ton truck containing a host of mechanical equipment. Once the waterproofing was done, there was plenty of time for reflection. Dale received a letter a few days before D-Day from his wife telling him he was going to be a father, and he thought, my own thoughts were that I had been incredibly stupid to agree with my wife to start a family at such a time, and that I could never hope to see her again. But the Lord was good, and that Christmas we had a son. I just thought that was really nice. He kind of questioning decisions to start a family during the war, and it all turned out well for him. And it's always nice to hear a good news story. But he was part of a team on a vehicle that had to waterproof the vehicle and get ready for landing. With that said, I want to start moving into talk about some of the U.S. units, and I might spend a little bit more time on these guys um, because the large portion of our audience is U.S. based. But I'm glad to have talked about some of our Commonwealth allies and what they saw and felt and did before they launched for D-Day. For this slide, I focused on the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and they had already made a number of assault landings. So they were kind of an experienced division. And a lot of them, while they were, coming off the Sicily operation, thought they were going to get pulled back and maybe sent back to the States and be a training division where they would train new units coming back over. But that was not to be the case. They were shipped back to England and were told to make themselves ready for the next assault. Sergeant Ted Offert was a communication technician in the 16th Infantry Regiment of the Big Red One, and he recalled the days leading up to D-Day quite clearly. We were taken to the south coast of England in a large bivouac area covered with trees. Tents were up and all over the place. We were strictly confined to the area, and no one was allowed in or out. Tanks, half-tracks, heavy artillery, every conceivable type of armament was placed under those trees. Every nook and cranny was utilized in some way. Rumors followed like crazy, but everyone knew this was it. Like everyone there, I kept wondering where and when. We did everything to amuse ourselves and take our minds off the task at hand. Anything to keep occupied. We checked and rechecked our weapons and equipment. We sharpened knives. We were only told to make it waterproof. The weapons, that is. About the fourth day, we got a real surprise. General Eisenhower came walking into our area. Everyone started saluting, and he insisted we be at ease. We formed a circle around him. I happened to be about 8 to 10 feet directly in front of him. He laid the whole bill of fare on us. We were going to land by sea on the coast of France, a place called Normandy. I know my heart was pounding like crazy. I wanted to know a million details. I guess everyone there did also. He was way ahead of us and explained that all the officers and NCOs would be briefed and could relay all the information to our men. He then saluted us and said, "Good luck," and he turned and left. Shortly after, all the NCOs were called into a large tent for instructions and briefings. There we were told that what our objectives were and what to expect in Normandy. And we were also told that a lot of men would die. We went over minute details, everything. Nothing was left out. And again, I already talked about the briefings, but you're going to hear this repeated often because a lot of the guys, that was one of the things that stood out to them most in their memories was the quality of the briefings. John Bastrika was a member of C Company of the 16th Infantry, and he also remembered his time in the marshalling area. I think it was the third week of May that we went to a camp near Weymouth. We were cut off from everyone. No letters, no mail at all. There was nothing to do but keep checking equipment. Just before we left the camp, it was either May 30th or somewhere on the 2nd of June, maybe. We had a shakedown looking for things that we weren't supposed to have, like a camera. I had one, and I buried it right outside the tent during the inspection before I could be caught. He had some really sharp memories about the briefings too, and I'm going to go into these. One day I had to go down with my buddy Bob McEwen to see the large relief map. It was fantastic. It had all the roads, houses, hedgerows, valleys. It was made of rubber and it was a natural color of the ground, water, streets, roads, etc. We had to look at the map and find the E1 and E3 draws, which would be known as Easy Red Beach. I think the password for D-Day was Mickey and Mouse. As a rifleman, I had an assault jacket. I had an impregnated clothes, my assault jacket with large pockets built and a built-in pack. I had an assault waterproof gas mask worn on my chest, and my M1 rifle, bayonet, trench knife, shovel, 3 bandoliers of ammo, 4 smoke grenades, 6 fragmentation grenades, and a pouch of 6 rifle grenades. Plus, I had K-ration boxes. I had swapped out K-rations for sandwich material, and I was able to make sandwiches and then stuff them in the K-ration boxes. I also had a D-bar. I had a double life preserver, which could be inflated with CO2 cartridges. Again, these are pretty amazing accounts. They're very detailed, and it's very cool to hear them. But moving on from the Big Red One, we're going to take a quick look at the Fighting Fourth and the 29ers. Both of those units were also part of the assault force, with the Fourth Division going into Utah Beach and the 29th heading for Omaha along with the Big Red One. Parker Gathing served in the 8th Infantry Regiment of the 4th Division. Prior to the invasion, we were briefed on the landing at Utah Beach. When we were briefed, we were put behind barbed wire with guards all around it. We could not talk to anybody on the outside. No information, and nobody could talk to us through the fence. Nobody was even allowed within 50 feet of the barbed wire fence on either side. Prior to departure, they gave us a steak dinner with all the trimmings. We laughed and kidded each other that it would be our last meal before we died. George Walter was another soldier in the Fighting Fourth, and he had experience similar to Gathing's. We went to a large marshalling area that was all fenced in, and MP guards were all around it. We stayed there for about 2 weeks. Then we were told about our mission, how we were going to assault the beaches of France at a place called Normandy. I think we were all relieved, finally knowing. One building in the center of this marshalling area was completely closed and windows blacked out. When we went in, and then on a large table lay a model of the coast of France. We were shown what our job was to be. It was to land on Utah Beach, Normandy, on the early morning of June 6, 1944. We would move inland as fast as we could, linking up with the 82nd and 101st Airborne, and then move on towards Cherbourg. The 29th, unlike the 4th, had spent so much time in England, they were almost viewed as like a palace guard force. I mean, they had come over very early and they had trained and trained and trained. And what I said about exercise fatigue could probably be applied to the 29th. But now that the invasion was coming, they're going to get put to the test. First Lieutenant Charles Lepiser, a platoon leader in Company M of the 115th Infantry, remembered the quality of the men in his unit. This is what stuck out to him more than the briefings was the men and how they would deal with knowing that they were part of the upcoming invasion. Spirits of the personnel were running high, and there was much ribbing and joking about being passed about among the troops. However, it's easy to detect the trend of conversations were generated as a means of an outlet to overcome the nervous tension and energy. The nervous tension and energy which prevailed could best be described as that of a highly trained men about to enter onto a field of competition, much like boxers must feel. Sometimes the fact was lost that assaulting the beach was only the one objective for units like the 29th. Lepiser continued, very exacting details were given at briefings for the purpose or orienting officers and men relative to the specific mission selected for each unit, including the overall big picture. Very close studies were made by all of the terrain of each of the assigned sectors. This was accomplished by map and terrain model studies. The terrain models were very exact and included a plotting of every known enemy defense installation and type. Every man and officer was to acquire complete familiarization of the locality in which they would be operating and once they were on the beach and in the area to be occupied by subsequent advances. But in the end, morale was high amongst the men. Let's give them hell all the way and get it over with real quick so we can all go home. There was not a sign of hesitation. Every man was ready and prepared to live up to the division motto, 29, let's go. I thought that was pretty interesting because while a lot of the younger men or the enlisted ranks talk about playing cards or hanging out with their buddies, here we have an officer, the 29th, who's actually giving you an update of what he sees about the men in his unit. And I thought that was very interesting that he talked about the morale. And there's going to be some differences of opinion when it comes to morale. And we're going to get to that in this next slide. We're starting to move on and look at some of the 101st airborne elements. In this case, we're going to go with some pop culture. We're going to go with the Easy 506. A couple of troopers. We're going to talk about them. On the slide, if you're viewing it, you can see the first account is from Robert Burr Smith of Easy Company. He served in 1st Platoon and company headquarters. He remembered loudspeakers blaring pop music. Don't sit under the apple tree was one of the ones that he remembered. And being fed steaks and ice cream and milk. And again, for those of you that haven't read a lot of accounts of the troops' time in England, food of that quality was in short supply at best. The men ate a lot of mutton. They ate a lot of corn or bully beef. They ate potatoes and turnips and cabbage. They got dehydrated milk. They got dehydrated eggs. They got dehydrated fruit. They were fed, but it wasn't fulfilling. And this is the first time that they had really been fed what they would call a home cooked meal. And Smith said I had the fatted calf feeling, like we were being fattened up for the kill. For Carwood Lipton, he spent time talking over the mission with Elmer Murray and wondering what it would be like. The two of them just sat there and talked about different scenarios. And I believe this ends up in Band of Brothers. I think Ambrose actually talked about this. But Carwood went on to say we had ice cream for dessert, and I attended Catholic services with Frank Percani. We also had classes on how to use our Mae Wests and drew even more ammo, K rations, and demolitions. If you really want to get a good accounting of what the 506 troopers what the 506 troopers experienced while they were there, I highly recommend getting yourself a copy of this if you haven't read it already. David Webster's Parachute Infantry. It's a very detailed account. The blue cover one like this is an early version where he uses pseudonyms for a lot of the men in his unit. If you get the later copies, they removed the pseudos and used the actual troopers' names. But it's very detailed, right down to the train ride. They get off the train, then they ride the trucks to the marshaling area. He talks about a pottery having flown out of there before. The tents were already in place. As soon as they got in, they were placed in their squad tents. At the time, Webster was not part of Easy Company. He was actually part of 2nd Battalion headquarters. He was an ammo bearer in the light machine gun platoon, but he had also spent time in Fox and Dog Company prior to that. So he makes his way around the entirety of 2nd Battalion over the course of the war. But in this case, he's part of that 2nd Battalion headquarters and the light machine gun platoon, like several other men that would go on to become Easy Company troopers, like Clancy Lyle, or former troopers like Bill Wingate. But he writes a very, very detailed account, everything from being able to watch movies, the latest movies, which we already heard about from one of the British troopers. They get plenty of, they're fed, they're told that they can eat as many times as they want when they go through the chow line. And he makes a point of saying, we were contemplating going to see a movie or going for thirds with the other guys in his tent. He also talked about the ammo issuance. There was lots of it. You could take pretty much what you want. But the thing that he speaks to that the other accounts that I've read through so far don't talk about it, obviously, because they're parachute troops. They are issued their parachute rigs. They go to a large cavernous hangar where all the riggers are there, and they start handing out kit bags with parachutes, primer, mains, and reserves, and they're there to test fit them. And that's what they do. They go through, they test fit them. If anything is off on them, if there's anything that's frayed, that chute is removed, and they are given a brand new one. They go through this, they test fit all the straps so that they're ready to go. And then everything's placed back in a kit bag, and they receive a paper tag on a piece of string that they write their name and unit on, tie it to the handles of the kit bag, and all the kit bags are placed by unit so that when the time comes for them to move out to the aircraft, they go and get their kit bag, and then they go to their aircraft and they'll put on their parachutes. And these are done in stick assignments. So, but it's a great account. I highly recommend it. He's very detailed in what he covers and talks about. For the 82nd, I'm gonna rely on the quote you see on the slide there. It has to do with the changing of a mission. In this case, Roy Creek, who was the company commander for Company E of the 507th. Those of you who know your 82nd history, or you know your Normandy history, it was Roy Creek and his men that took the bridge at Chef du Pont, and held it during on D-Day and D+1. He was a very gallant officer and he's very well known across the 82nd Airborne history. For most units, their missions and objectives have been laid out for months. In the 82nd Airborne, there were slight changes. Some of this had to do with the repositioning of enemy units. Aerial reconnaissance showed units moving around, and also the placement of anti-airborne defenses. Creek talks about them being informed that the 91st Luftland Division had been moved into the general area of Saint-Sever-le-Vicomte, and were busy engaging in constructing passive and active anti-airborne defenses. The passive defenses consisted of Rommel asparagus and an elaborate system of anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, and booby traps. The asparagus were nothing more than poles spaced at intervals on all likely landing zones in the area, and then also having barbed wires strung between the poles. These made for treacherous obstacles for the glider echelon. The active defenses consisted of prepared gun positions and concentrators capable of firing observed fire from Hill 110, the highest point in the area. It looked as though intelligence was working overtime for both sides, according to Creek. So they made slight changes to the plan to accommodate the new information. Despite all those planning changes, troopers like Staff Sergeant John D. Booth had an experience in the marshaling area, much like many others. During our stay at the airfield, the sand table sessions were quite frequent and thorough. It would appear our objectives would be easily secured without too much trouble, or even easier. As a matter of fact, they had us so convinced that when we were issued our rations, most everybody ate all the good rations before we even left England. And this was not the thing to do, but we were fairly convinced that this operation was not going to be all that rough. Other than sand tables and strategy sessions, our time was spent playing softball, eating, writing letters, resting, and watching movies. And we were housed in large hangars where we were cotted down. With faces blackened and bodies loaded to the hilt, our company formation was called before our departure to the plains to leave around 2200 or 2300 hours. Our company commander, Captain Gerard A. Ruddy, talked to us and presented a well thought out speech. We were prepared, he said, and it was up to us to use that preparation and ingenuity to take care of the Germans. Of course, the one-day postponement of our invasion came as a shock and a disappointment, but coming early in the day, as we did the day before D-Day or 2 days at that time, I recall it caused not too much confusion. We knew the invasion was close at hand at any rate, and we knew it was going to happen. What's interesting is if you think about Boone's account, especially when thinking about the postponement and how he said there was a shock and disappointment, this runs counter to David Webster's account of the news of the postponement, and which he basically describes it as like a one-day postponement of your execution. Uh, he characterizes it differently, and I don't know if that's because he wrote his account not soon after the war was over, and Boone's was written much further down the road when he had a little bit more time of reflection. But also, you had to know that a lot of some of the 82nd units were experienced and been in battle before, and maybe that's just how they looked at the situation. But I thought it was an interesting fact to point out the contrast between the two accounts of that. Um, as they got closer and closer, the commanders started moving around to the different camps to have pep talks with their troops. In this case, we're going to look at Monty first. Uh, and the quote there was one that he largely used often. According to Alan Moorhead, the correspondent back then, and also a part-time Monty biographer, he wrote, "Good luck to each of you and good hunting on the mainland of Europe." Moorhead said that Monty's speeches were generally well received by the troops, which is also funny because any of you who've watched World at War, specifically the episode that covers D-Day, there is most decidedly a British trooper in there who is not pleased with it and referred to the good hunting line as complete rubbish. But Moore had said that by and large the men received Monty's pep talks well, and he said he heard it at least 50 times. So that should tell you the breadth and width of Monty's travels to go speak to his men. And whatever you may think about Monty, a commander's job is to lead and to be at the front, and it speaks very well of him as a leader to go to each of his the major marshaling areas and speak to his men. Um, and we all know that Ike had done the same thing. He, there's a whole series of very famous photos that get trundled out every D-Day anniversary, and I'm sure we'll see them coming out in the next few days. This photo is him visiting with Company E of 2nd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment at Greenham Common. Many of the troops remembered Ike being very emotional during his visit. Uh, he typically would just ask them where they were from. Oftentimes, he used the same line with different troopers. They would say where they were from, and he'd talk about the fishing in that location. In fact, that the photo of him with Wally Strobel's stick, I believe it was 23, where Ike he's moving his hand around, and for the longest time, the caption has always been nothing but complete victory. Um, but really, the men that were around him, close to him, said he was talking about fly fishing during that whole sequence. So it's interesting how a photo can be misinterpreted by the folks that weren't there. And interestingly, if you go back to my episode with Chuck Hedrick, when we did our episode on Robert Capa's D-Day, he talked about how Capa didn't write captions for a lot of his photographs, and when they were sent back, it was up to the folks at the headquarters where I believe it was Time Life he was working for, sent back to them, and it was up to them to interpret what was in the photograph and write the caption. I would think that this is probably a uh, pretty similar instance here. And again, they remembered him being very emotional. And Kay Summersby, his driver, said when they got back to their car, Ike said to her, Kay, it's very tough to look a man in the eye when you may be sending him off to his death. And that always struck me that despite the fact that it obviously weighed on him heavily and emotional, with a lot of emotional gravitas, he still went there and did it, much like, Monty did with his men. He went and visited these men and egged them on and supported them. Uh, but several troopers remembered as their planes were trundling down the runway, looking out the window and seeing Ike standing by his car about halfway down the runway, saluting the aircraft. And in some cases, the men said they could clearly see that he had been crying upon their departure. So they're pretty amazing when you think about it. But again, Ike doing what good commanders do, leading from the front in this case, or at least seeing his men off. So with the launch of the airborne forces, we'll backtrack. In this case, you still have to move all these forces to their embarkation points now. So and many of the infantry units, not the airborne units, have to pack up into their vehicles or march from the marshaling areas over to the embarkation points. There's this great quote here, and I liked putting it here because it matched up well with the image on the slide deck. And if you're looking at this, you can see all these vehicles lined up on this small, this town in England somewhere, brick walls everywhere. And the quote says, "The hedges along the way suffered badly from vehicles too outsized for such tiny countryside. And in the little towns, a U.S. sergeant observed, tanks not built for maneuvering in such cramped space had knocked off pieces of corner buildings as they attempted to make sharp turns on little streets that had never expected to cope with anything worse than a coach and four." So it's pretty amazing when you think about all these drivers um, moving these vehicles out and cutting corners and taking out little chunks of buildings as they're trying to get the vehicles towards the embarkation points. And Ray Nance, who was with the 29th Infantry Division, he was one of the only surviving officers of his company on D-Day. And if you could see the photo, half tracks and tanks as far as the eye can see. And Ray said, "We were loaded onto trucks and proceeded to the port of embarkation, which in our case was Weymouth in southern England. We'd traveled this way before once on a dry run, and there'd been nothing along the road. But this time there was so much equipment parked along the road and in the fields that it seemed like the whole island would tilt and slide into the channel." And as the men made their way, it was interesting to see how the locals would turn out. And I'm sure many of you have probably read or seen accounts of the English citizens coming out and waving off the boys as they move to their embarkation points. A lot of times crying as they did so. In this case, is a great picture of milk bottles being handed to a British vehicle as it moves towards its embarkation point. Um, the men threw candy and chewing gum to the kids. The um, the British citizens brought out cakes and tea and coffee to share with the men as they made their way out. And it was a very emotional time because by this time, a lot of these units had spent probably close to a year in those areas, so they'd become very friendly with the locals there, and it was a very emotional time for both sides. Um, Many of the guys talking about how they didn't know whether or not they would ever see the uh, home again, or in this case, what had become a substitute home for them. Um, and Everett Booth, who was a platoon leader in the Big Red One, remembered the drive to the embarkation point We then loaded onto a deuce. We loaded onto deuce and a half trucks and headed for Weymouth, where we loaded onto military transports. As we drove through several little English villages, all of our English neighbors were out waving goodbye to us, and many times they were crying. And that's pretty much how I want to wrap up this episode, because again, I wanted to look at the invasion not from the action on D-Day, but the run up to it, and to talk about what the guys were experiencing as they prepared themselves for this next, we'll call it a big adventure, but I'm sure some of them didn't think of it as a big adventure. They probably, much like David Webster, thought about it as the hangman, waiting for the hangman. But the we can sit here and debate about casualties on the different beaches and who suffered more, but at the end of the day, these men were all important pieces of the puzzle in terms of the assault force. They were all needed. They all had jobs to do. And it was just interesting hearing what they had focused on when they thought back about their memories of those days, whether it be the briefings, or if you're an officer, how the men looked and acted, or what you did to prepare yourself and your equipment or your vehicle. These are all important aspects of the invasion that I think doesn't get talked about quite enough in my mind. And I hope everybody enjoys this particular episode as much as I did. Uh, Now for a little housekeeping, it's going to be a little bit of a hiatus. I may do a quick hit for D-Day if I'm available. I'm actually going on vacation with the family, so we're going to have a skip in the normal rotation of pods. I will get back to it and get them loaded up as soon as I can, recorded and loaded up. I hope you'll bear with me. It's been really amazing doing this particular pod. If you are interested in going over a few of our D-Day pods, there's a whole host of them. You can check out on our YouTube channel, or you can go back through any of your podcatchers. Uh, there's got to be at least, I don't know, maybe 10 D-Day related pods in there. So feel free to go back and peruse a few of them. In particular, call out the one I did with Dev Ramsamy on the naval combat demolition units and the engineering special brigades on D-Day. I thought that was a great one. There's plenty on the Airborne uh, and actions that they're involved in. If you want, you can go over and check out Woody's World War II TV channel on YouTube. I've done a couple of D-Day shows with him, including his monumental 2020, I believe it was 2020, uh, almost 16 days of streaming. And I did an episode on the battle at Holdy. And then obviously I did my own show on it where I updated information that I'd found. There's plenty of stuff out there for D-Day. I hope you'll go back and check it out. If you've got questions, if you've got observations, please make sure you add comments or send me emails. I love to get correspondence from viewers and listeners. Love engaging everybody and talking about um, this subject, the subject of World War II and the subject of the World War II fighting men and women. So uh, I hope everybody has a lovely couple of weeks, and let's not forget the real reason why we're looking back and I'll say celebrating, but we're honoring 81st anniversary of D-Day. And I hope you all have a wonderful time remembering these great heroes that took part in that monumental day. But take care, everyone.